Hi, welcome to the Ecolabs webinar series. Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the Ecolab webinar series. My name is Ryan Jit, and I'm leading the Smart Cities and Future Mobility efforts at Ecolab's Center of Innovation for Energy, or Ecolab for short. I'll be hosting today's session. Ecolabs, jointly established by Nanyang Technological University, Enterprise Singapore, and Sustainable Energy Association Singapore, aims to build and accelerate deep tech energy innovation capabilities in Singapore to support the nation's future energy transition. This joint initiative aims to help Singapore-based energy startups and SME to successfully commercialize and scale their innovation effort by providing them with the following: translational research, living test beds, innovation programs, funding partners, and community platform. We are organizing the Ecolabs webinar series to enhance the engagement and interaction with our partners, where we invite industrial experts to offer their insight. This webinar series comprises of 5 themes: Startup Series, Insight Series, Corporate Series, Investor Series, and Ecolab Series, each focusing on the different aspects of the innovation ecosystem. Today's session is part of the Ecolabs Insight webinar series to provide industrial insight to understand and navigate the innovation journey in the energy sector. You'll also learn about the different aspects of the startup ecosystem, market analysis, and what to look out for and where are the different opportunities. Today's webinar is part of a partnership between Ecolabs and Lux Research, where Lux Research provides targeted market briefings and market intelligence through the Lux Tech signal. Ecolabs is happy to partner with Lux Research to bring interesting market insight and briefings to you. Based in the US with global presence, Lux Research combines deep analysis of technology with business insight to deliver independent, fact-based analysis, insights, and opinions. Today's webinar titled The Future of Smart Cities Post-Covid-19, presented by Mr. Harshit Sharma, Digital Transformation Analyst, Lux Research. He will share their analysis on the effect of COVID-19 has had on the 4 key themes of smart cities mobility, energy, digitalization, and governance, and provide a perspective on whether the pandemic will accelerate or derail the development of smart cities in the near future. A quick introduction of the speaker. Harshit leads the Lux Research services for the digital transformation of heavy industries such as oil and gas, mining, and marine sectors, and is based in Lux Research Singapore office. His research focuses on technological developments and market trends impacting the energy sector, ranging from digital oil field to crude refining and petrochemicals. Harshit has deep expertise in key emerging technologies such as digital twins, oil field autonomy, crude to chemicals, and gas detection and capture. Prior to joining Lux Research, Harshit designed and manufactured completion tools as an R&D engineer at Halliburton. Specifically, his work led to new innovation in liner hangers and shell packer for open hole completion. Harshit received his MS from the National University of Singapore in mechanical engineering, with a focus on offshore technology catered for the subsea market in Malaysia. So towards the end of today's session, we will have about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, you can key your question in the Q&A box or raise your hand so that we can unmute you to voice your question during the interaction session. Now, without further ado, we would like to pass the session to Mr. Harshit. Harshit, please.
Yes, thank you so much, Ryan, for that lovely introduction, and also appreciate you also just setting up the stage for Lux as well. So good afternoon, everyone. I really appreciate you joining together. Hope everybody is staying safe and well. And as you can see, the discussion today is about smart cities and how it's going to behave in a post-COVID world. So from the outset, I mean, this is the issue of COVID is something that's on the mind for almost all of us across the world today. And this is going to be an extremely dynamic topic in the first place. It's going to behave, change its just parameters across the world with time. So whatever analysis we are doing today and we'll be doing consistently at Lux is going to require revisiting, because what we're going through today is, of course, unprecedented. So with that said, before I get into my presentation a bit further, let me just quickly go through Lux again. I think Ryan did mention it briefly. So all I would say is that we specifically focus on innovation and emerging technologies, and the kind of webinars that we're doing today, Lux does it consistently. So certainly stay on the lookout. You can follow us on social media, be it on LinkedIn, on Twitter, just to stay updated on these kind of sort of opportunities. So with that said, coming towards the webinar for today, we did want to first talk about sort of the impact COVID is having on just any industry in general. So regardless of smart cities, what exactly is the immediate impact of COVID? And like I said earlier, that COVID itself is a very dynamic situation. Things are going to consistently evolve. And what we can do is to prepare ourselves for a post-COVID world. So there are many speculations, many discussions going around as how the world will really appear after COVID-19 eventually ends. So we're going to give our sort of perception, our opinions on that. And based on those trends, we're going to offer today to all of you a framework or a methodological way of looking at COVID and really analyzing every sort of sector technology with that framework. So we'll set that framework up first and then use it to really understand what's the impact on smart cities. And of course, based on that analysis, we'll talk of some, prioritization, industry actions that all of you can really take note of. And then lastly, some final takeaways from this entire session. Now, when it comes to COVID, I'm sure many people, you might have read in the public domain as well, that a lot of them are comparing COVID-19 to many sort of historic like economic recessions or any of the previous sort of occurrences, world wars or whatever the case. But for anyone who's seen the data, the quantification, you can easily see that COVID is highly unprecedented. The kind of things we are seeing in COVID has not been seen in the past. So this was the first time, of course, in human history that oil prices went negative. And it's not just oil prices. Many commodity pricing has been highly impacted. We've seen industries like aviation, hotels extremely getting affected from COVID, and unemployment has been significantly high. We're looking at roughly 30 million people in the US alone who are currently unemployed, all because of how COVID-19 has panned out. So it's important to call out that the new normal is what we need to really think of. So we're never really going to go back to how the world truly was before COVID. So we're looking at a new normal, and the future we're talking of today is sort of based around that sort of new setting for the world. So we've done our research and we have really done our analysis in terms of how different people or different sort of organizations, and based on our primary research, different companies we've spoken to, really look at COVID. And by the end of it, we are seeing these 5 major trends that are going to define the post-COVID world. And I would like to call out that these trends don't really talk about directly diagnosing and treating the disease itself, but it's broadly speaking at the lasting impact of the pandemic in the first place. And this analysis is mostly future looking. So this is something we're looking at maybe a year from now, or at least 6 months from now, at least after COVID finally ends in that sense. But there are 5 major trends that we see going to really impact the world. The first one is infection prevention. The second, which we all are doing today, is remote commerce. The third is going to be an improved resiliency across the world in any sort of manufacturing, supply chain, whatever be the case, and a higher need for agility in almost any task or activity we do. And of course, the last trend, which I just briefly mentioned of, was the macroeconomic impacts that we're seeing. Sporadic drop in investments and new bailouts being done, companies going bankrupt, or whatever be the case. So let's quickly walk through each of these trends, just really see what exactly they mean and how they're going to impact the development on any technology and, of course, smart cities also. So infection prevention, of course, is something that we all are doing today. It's basically any habits, any sort of ideation around personal hygiene, sanitation, whatever we are doing today to guard against this particular disease. And these kind of habits, these kind of policies, frameworks are being deployed right now. So the onset has been immediate and is going to stay with us once COVID also ends. So its impact as a trend is going to be a long term. So for example, policies or practices such as screening somebody for a certain disease marker, like temperature scans, or like certain biomarkers, which we all are seeing being used in Singapore, many restaurants. These are the kind of things that will continue. Or just a higher use of personal equipment or hygiene products like a sanitizer. Even if when COVID-19 goes away, a lot of people will still continue maintaining the use of sanitization, something like that. And of course, ideas such as let's make sure that there's less crowding of people in certain areas, so the consumer behavior changing, maybe less frequency of people going towards retail, towards malls or anything like that. All these kind of behaviors that we're seeing in infection prevention are going to stay for the long term. Remote commerce, there's not much to speak of here. Of course, we all are currently doing work from home. Almost any industry which is highly dependent on knowledge sharing, which is highly dependent on white collar work, is currently doing a bit of a remote commerce in some way or the other. And again, because of this sort of immediate onset of this trend, there's going to be a long-term impact on the world, on the new normal of the world once we do end from COVID-19. So some of the things we are already seeing is, of course, the on-demand delivery of food and retail, which gradually spiked when all the cities in the world went through a lockdown. More and more use of digital tools for e-commerce, for fashion, apparel, whatever be the case. Schooling, universities going towards distance learning, and just even fitness classes for that matter, today are being done online. And new sort of technology domains like digital therapeutics, telemedicine, all sort of gaining traction because of remote commerce. And so again, in the new normal of the world, these kind of examples will probably stay with us, even when there's no sort of virus lingering around in the first place. Speaking of sort of the post-COVID world, and this third trend, which is going to stay with us as well, is going to be improved resiliency. So while we all can agree that international trade took a hit, but it's not going to go away in the long term, but the supply chains across the world, especially in regards to logistics, are going to be looking for extremely greater decentralization. And any company who has a far-flung supply chain will like to be extremely resilient, just making sure that things don't break down because one particular country has an infestation or anything like that. So some of the examples that will have a lasting impact could be increased automation, new alternative manufacturing solutions like factory in a box, modular manufacturing, a bigger emphasis on do-it-yourself sort of home production ideas for people instead of actually buying goods from retail in the first place. The digital transformation of supply chains using different technologies, asset monitoring to make sure visibility, reliability of supply chains is much more higher, and the decentralization of energy as well. So you're using microgrids, distributed sources like solar, wind, whatever be the case. And kind of linked to resiliency is also the agility. So again, because the black swan nature of COVID-19, nobody really prepared themselves, whether it's in supply chains, whether it's in production or any industry in general, no one really prepared themselves to really pivot, to really shift around the world as new things sort of come through. So we all have learned that any organization, any city for that matter, requires higher agility in the way they quickly sort of, like quickly pivot or have an option to go to a different process or product in the first place. So there are going to be many sort of examples here which would stay for the long term. A good example would be, of course, 3D printing, which is kind of like a manufacturing solution which is really on the go, depending on the requirement that you come in. And of course, today, most of manufacturing is still subtractive in nature, but hydrogen manufacturing could see a bigger adoption as things sort of move ahead. And similarly, the more implementation or use of Agile, of course, the software industry uses this quite frequently, but you could see similar thinking sort of coming into the manufacturing side of things, coming into the construction side of things as people want to move things much faster than historically things have been. And then lastly, the trend we see, of course, which is going to have a lasting impact on anything for that matter, is going to be the macroeconomic impact that has unfortunately been not the best for anyone. It's been an economic shock. And I earlier mentioned that it's not just the commodity prices. We have seen a massive amount of layoffs happening across the world. Even Asian countries like Korea, for that matter, today have 20% unemployment. So things have been spiking really badly. And what it means for technology or just innovation in general is that you're going to see a shortfall in demand. So this is linked to, of course, any sort of consumer behavior. But gradually, you will see a lower capex spending. We're going to see cut down in R&D sort of optionalities. The long-term priorities for research and innovation are going to change. Startups are going to see a smaller funding cycle as well. And similarly, almost any commodity price is going to stay low. So of course, this is also going to have an onset which is immediate, but at the same time, hopefully the economic sort of recovery will happen. So this is going to be at least a short to medium term trend. In the long term, we will see a return of investments coming into technology or funding for that matter. So again, looking at these 5 trends on a whole, if I were just to quickly call them out again, infection prevention, the habits we have built to make sure the infection doesn't move forward, remote commerce, which we all are doing today, resiliency and agility in your supply chains and manufacturing, and the macroeconomic impacts. All these sort of 5 trends essentially are going to play a role in how technology development has moving forward. So if you see on the figure on the right, what we have sort of created here is sort of a framework or a way of thinking around any sort of technology you're looking into or any sort of even industrial application you're looking into to really gauge where things are going for them in the post-COVID-19. So on this sort of framework for any sort of specific technology, you can look at the impacts. If you do your analysis, you can score on this framework whether it's a positive impact, highly negative impact, what is the time frame on that impact? So the bubbles sort of give us a near term, medium term, long term impact, and the size of the bubble sort of describes what is the scale of the impact. So when we talk about scale, we're looking at more of the number of investments being done or purely the headcount of certain people being involved, whatever the case. So using this sort of analysis, you can see and conclude how a specific technology is going to get impacted from these 5 trends. And for today's discussion, we're going to use this framework for the smart cities as well and see how exactly it pans out. But of course, feel free to use this for any analysis you have internally as well. Right. So coming towards smart cities, I think the question for everyone today on this webinar, of course, is that what's the short-term or long-term impact of COVID on smart cities as well as a concept? And I think before we get into that, it's really critical to call out that how a smart city is defined or what that concept means, it varies a lot. And the different sort of ways of looking at it, there are many sort of organizations that talk about the design of the city as well, the construction that is happening there. But at least for Lux, how we look at a smart city is that it incorporates digital technologies. It's fundamentally industrial IoT to resolve any challenges that have always been around in mobility, energy, digitization or digitalization, depending on where you are, and lastly, governance. So you're using these technologies to really solve the same pain points or pressing matters that have always been around. And that's sort of how we sort of analyze smart cities as well. So it's not just one specific technology, it's a combination of several technologies, and they all sort of come together to really help a city govern or improve the quality of life for its citizens, or whatever be the case. And just like any other technology sector, whether it's the automotive industry, the aviation industry, sort of the first thing that comes into our mind is that COVID-19 is going to have an extremely negative impact on smart cities as well. And of course, as I earlier called out, that it's still too soon to actually say, how this pandemic is going to impact any technology. But if you were to go look in the public domain, you will see some disappointing news. So for example, Sidewalk Labs, which is a subsidiary of Alphabet, actually in 2017 signed a project for a mega smart city in Toronto. This was supposed to be 800 square meters, a very interesting project, but just I think a month back, it was unfortunately canceled, with the main reason being unprecedented economic uncertainty. So we are seeing a lot of smart city projects eventually being canceled, and that's of course not good news. But at the same time, these events can also be considered in isolation. What we need to do is break the smart city down, talk about its components and see where things are moving, and then we can conclude if COVID has a positive or a negative impact sort of on the vision of smart cities. So a good way of looking at a smart city will be, again, looking at its taxonomy. So what we have done here on this sort of image is that talk about the 3 main components of a smart city. So you will see we are not really talking about governance. That's something that Lux doesn't directly look into, but if you're interested, we can always talk about it offline. But the 3 areas we have been specifically researching on is the smart infrastructure, which is sort of the foundation of a smart city. When you create the industrial IoT network in the city, to create the data or the insights in the first place. The second vertical for a smart city is going to be its mobility, making sure that the electrification, autonomy, ride sharing, everything is on the go. So you reduce traffic congestion, pollution, whatever be the case. And then lastly is the aspect of smart energy, making sure that the city is green, making sure that you're using land much more effectively, and of course, reducing pollution as well. Now, for each of these sort of taxonomies of the smart city, what we're going to do today is call out 4 specific technologies that in recent times have really come across as highly critical for them to succeed. So for each of these technologies, we're going to score them on the framework and cumulatively see what is the end result for the smart city in regards to whether it's being a positive or negative impact from COVID-19. So when it comes to smart infrastructure, the 4 technologies we want to discuss today are 5G, telemedicine, robotics, and wearables. And these technologies are something we have handpicked because, like I was earlier mentioned, there are tons of technologies that will be used in a smart city. It's more about calling out the ones which are innovative, emerging, as something that's going to really behave or change because of COVID-19. So let's go through one by one with each of these technologies and see how COVID is really impacting all of them. So starting off with 5G, and I think the main sort of bullet here or takeaway is that its rollout is going to slightly slow down because of COVID, but its impact will still come. It's just going to be slightly a delayed sort of impact for 5G. So in the figure on the right, you can see our analysis here that when it comes to 5G, there's not much of an impact from the trend of infection prevention, but remote commerce really does drive the deployment of 5G further. So you're going to see much of a stronger positive impact of 5G developments because of remote commerce. Similarly, the macroeconomic impacts is going to have a somewhat of a negative impact on 5G as well. Essentially because more and more capital investments that are required to set up a 5G infrastructure are going to be taken away. So overall, we do see a positive impact on 5G, but at least for the medium term, it's going to be somewhat of a stalled development. Eventually, it's going to rise up back. And this kind of analysis sort of mirrors what we have seen in the industry as well. So for GSMA, for example, has called out that it's going to sort of cut down the forecast for 5G deployments in this year by at least 25%. And similarly, what we're also seeing is that the use case for 5G is also sort of moving a bit. So a lot of the initial discussion on 5G was of its use in residential applications, but now it's slightly pivoting towards manufacturing, where remote commerce essentially requires less people to come, and you're hoping to have stronger connectivity to get people sort of dial in on calls, whatever be the case. So definitely 5G is going to have an impact from COVID. Initially, it's going to stall, but subsequently it's going to come back and an overall positive impact because of COVID in regards to its development or deployment. Now, a different story altogether is going to be telemedicine, which is essentially the use of digital technologies to really offer medicine, or this could be in the form of a consultation with a doctor. It could be a discussion on mental health, whatever be the case, being done over the phone or over a video call. Now, telemedicine is going to see an amazingly high adoption because of COVID-19. And I think the rationale here is quite, I would say, obvious. Whether it's infection prevention, remote commerce, or just having higher resiliency and agility within your staff or anything like that, all of these trends point towards the more adoption of telemedicine. So it's definitely a strong positive impact because of COVID, and this impact is going to last at least for the medium term. So when I say medium term, at least 2 or 3 years. The long term is something you're looking at 5 years down the line. Now, another reason why telemedicine is seeing a high adoption is because the regulations are quickly being relaxed as well. So that's where sort of the cities are also coming through. A lot of the governments are removing the restrictions that were historically on telemedicine and allowing for really participating in telemedicine as well. So this is definitely an opportunity coming up while 5G was still stalling through. When it comes to telemedicine, any sort of pharma company or healthcare provider is definitely going to look into telemedicine. Now, similar sort of story for robotics as well, because of the fact that almost any manufacturing or supply chain will want to reduce the labor it has, want to reduce the kind of mingling of its staff, whatever be the case, to really ensure infection can be prevented. Any form of automation, which you can do with robotics, is going to be accepted. So Trends such as prevention, remote commerce, resiliency, making your supply chain just a lot more solid, agility are going to really impact robotics, so in a positive sense. The only negative which we are seeing so far is that because of the macroeconomic impacts, a lot of the investments in robotics or startups have sort of stalled, which is somewhat expected because a lot of the fundings are right now being sort of scrutinized. But in the longer term, robotics are going to see a much of a positive impact. And one of the interesting things what we are seeing is that because of COVID-19, as more and more deployment of robotics happens, actually a lot of the piloting or testing of robotics, which historically could not be done because people were just not interested, could finally be done today. So it's also going to remove the barriers which you have seen in sort of cultural adoption of robotics in manufacturing or even industrial plants for that matter. And then lastly, speaking about wearables, which is of course a technology that you will be requiring for just making sure everybody is monitored, making sure everyone's health is being taken care of in just in a much more data collection manner. And infection prevention is one of the main reasons why we'll see more adoption of wearables happening. And I think, again, for context, we know in Singapore there was a discussion for using certain kind of tagging devices or wearables to be given to people just to make sure we can track and monitor everyone's health a lot better. So definitely any organization when it comes to the industrial side of things who unfortunately can't avoid gathering of people will use wearables moving forward. And even though there's going to be a bit of a negative impact from the funding side of things in the longer term, wearables will see a much more adoption in smart cities or anything like that because of its ability to really track and just make sure everyone's health is fine. So overall, you can see that when it comes to the initial infrastructure of a city, when you're talking about foundational digital technologies, they all are going to see rapid adoption. They're going to see much more positive impact in terms of its testing, trials, investments in the longer term as well. So now let's talk about the mobility side of a smart city. And so the four technologies we see are really critical for this aspect of the city are shared mobility, autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles, and electric aviation. So now starting off with shared mobility, this is going to be the first technology which unfortunately we see going to have a negative impact because of COVID. And again, the rationale for this can be looked on the figure on the right. If you see infection prevention, then shared mobility doesn't really go along with it. We're already seeing a lot of companies who are working in ride sharing for that matter, seeing a lot of loss in revenue. Similarly in Singapore, for example, new policies have come through, a Grab. If you do take a Grab share right now, you can only have 2 passengers in it. You can't have someone sitting in the front. And people in general, the consumer is less inclined to use Grab share as well. So because of infection prevention, a lot of the sort of growth for ride sharing is going to get impacted. Another reason that we are seeing is the macroeconomic impacts. And when it comes to shared mobility, this is a much bigger concern because many ride sharing companies, and this could include Uber and Lyft, historically have not been profitable. And how they survive is that they consistently bailed out by the VCs or investors. But in these kind of environments, if a ride-sharing company does go like bankrupt or anything like that, it's unlikely that more investors will come in and sort of bail them out. So, of course, there's going to be a big impact on the development of shared mobility and any technology that goes along with it. And the best bet for these companies is going to be to build new sort of business models, which everything we have seen here. A lot of companies moving towards food delivery or grocery deliveries, like what Food Panda or anybody else is also sort of looking into. So likewise, autonomous vehicles as well. In the near term, there's going to be a bit of a big hit for autonomy. Again, because this is a very capital intensive technology. It requires a lot of trialing and testing in certain lab environments. And since there's going to be less funding going around, initially you will see a negative impact on it. But eventually, an autonomous vehicle is the answer for remote commerce and infection prevention. For example, if you eliminate a driver in a vehicle altogether, then definitely it's a positive sort of opportunity for infection prevention. But in the near term, because anyway we are not seeing any traffic going around, we are seeing less people on the road for that matter, it's difficult to really build more data. So for autonomous vehicles, you need to monitor traffic, see what kind of data you're getting to train your algorithms, whatever be the case. But if there isn't much movement in the first place, you can't really move the trialing and testing of autonomous vehicles as well. So overall here, you're going to see a near-term sort of a hindrance for autonomous vehicles. In the long term, things are going to come back, but at least in the medium term, you're going to see that autonomous vehicles will not really see much of a development. So it's going to be a stalled progression because of COVID here. Now, likewise, electric vehicles as well. Unfortunately, even though we do see them in the longer term being extremely important and having no impact altogether from COVID, but in the near term, because of the macroeconomic impacts, EVs will suffer a slight sort of issue with adoption as well. And the main reason being because an electric vehicle, unfortunately, today is not profitable. So when you have an economic environment where people are looking at saving, where people are looking to make sure that every dollar counts, a purchase of an electric vehicle is going to be a lot more difficult. And this is going to be a lot more sort of in sync with countries such as the US, where there isn't much of a regulatory support for electric vehicles. So if you go to countries like Europe or even China for that matter, you will see still adoption happening because the governments are supporting EVs. But in a free market, most of the EVs will suffer purely from a cost point of view. So we still see it as a neutral impact because EVs are still going to help in a more resilient sort of infrastructure. But in the near term, it's going to have a sort of a stalled progression similar to autonomy as well. And then lastly, coming to something more futuristic or a bit something that, of course, today is not in adoption is electric aviation. Now, this is a technology that is still a decade away or 15 years away, but it's definitely part of a smart city. You have electric aviation, you can avoid traffic congestion, you can make sure people can travel much more quicker as well. So overall, how we see is that there's going to be a slight positive impact on electric aviation, mainly because electric planes today are really prepared for serving smaller base of customers. So the fact that the aviation industry has suffered so much and people want to travel in smaller groups, they want to travel in smaller distances, might actually enable an opportunity for electric planes to be used. So I think in countries like Norway, for that matter, if you're flying a group of 25 people, 30 people, then using an electric plane might just make more sense. And now people actually would rather pay more and fly in smaller groups. So this could see a bit of an adoption for electric aviation, but again, this is going to happen at least in the 5 or 6 years down the line, not really in the near term. But so overall, you can see that the impact of COVID on the mobility side of things is actually quite mixed. When it comes to to shared mobility is definitely going to suffer. Autonomy is also going to suffer, and electric vehicles are quite neutral. So the mobility side of a smart city is where things are going to change a bit in the post sort of COVID world. So finally, coming to the smart energy element of a smart city, there are 4 main sort of technologies that we are monitoring here exclusively, and these are going to be renewables, of course, residential solar for that matter, hydrogen, which is an emerging sort of tool as well, alternative fuels or biofuels for that matter, and home energy management systems. So again, kicking off with renewables in the first place, it's very important to call out that COVID-19 will fundamentally push the energy transition even forward. And the main reason for that is that renewable energy actually activates more resiliency for a country. So if you have more residential solar, if you have more wind in your country, you're less dependent on the imports of oil, natural gas, coal, or any other commodity for that matter. So the fact that renewables are going to make more resiliency, they're going to actually help in infection prevention. Most renewable projects don't require the same amount of staff as a conventional power plant does. It's going to improve visibility in commerce as well. Because again, less people need to go to a certain site for that matter. So renewables are going to see a really positive impact and more adoption, especially in the residential side of things. The only sort of negative impact of COVID here is going to be the investments, because unfortunately, renewable energy projects are not that money-making or not that positive as maybe a fossil fuel project could be. So in the near term, you will see some budgets being held off, but we don't see that being a highly negative impact. So in the next 1 year or so, you will see the renewable energy industry actually kicking off even more because of COVID-19. Now, on the sort of same page is going to be hydrogen as well. So hydrogen is an extremely sort of new contender in the energy transition. It's considered to be blue initially, that you'll produce hydrogen from methane, but recently new technology is pushing for green hydrogen, that is the production of hydrogen from renewable energy as well. So it again ties back to the idea of resiliency. If you have a local ecosystem with renewable energy and you can produce hydrogen from that, then this fuel can be used to decarbonize many industries. It could be steel manufacturing, cement manufacturing, large-scale sort of manufacturing plants, whatever be the case. So this could act as a sort of supplement to a renewable energy ecosystem. And again, it's going to suffer from the macroeconomic impacts as well, because hydrogen is a very extremely early stage technology. And as long as the funding or the budgets are sort of held off, hydrogen is going to suffer as well. But in the longer term, it's going to really supplement the sort of development of a renewable energy ecosystem in a city as well. Now, unlike hydrogen and also renewable energy, we don't really see a positive future for alternative fuels. So when I speak of alternative fuels, I mean synthetic fuels like biofuels, which traditionally have been considered green fuels as well. So unfortunately, most of these fuels are also imported, like the way oil or natural gas is. Certain countries like Malaysia might have a resilient system. They might have their own biofuels ecosystem, but by and large, a lot of trade is done for biofuels. And because of the macroeconomic impacts, for the matter that budgets or just trade in general has been stopped, and the fact that oil is so cheap, it is going to really hit the biofuels industry. And the reason why we see this as a negative impact is because by the time biofuels might recover, the world might just realize that actually using electrification or electric vehicles is a much better solution than actually going for biofuels, because these in the end do produce emissions, at the end user stage. So it's going to be a situation where alternative fuels are going to miss the boat by the time a recovery happens. So of all these technologies we have spoken today, biofuels is something we really see is going to end or move out of the picture for any smart cities in the future. And then lastly, coming towards home energy management systems. And again, this is going to have a very positive impact. COVID-19 is definitely going to accelerate their deployment and even investments in this technology moving forward. And the main reason for that is because more and more people are now working from home. So remote commerce, people are staying home. So you're using more energy at home. And that incentivizes everybody, not just the retailer, but also the end user, to think about ways to really save energy consumption. So you're going to be looking into new services, new sort of smart tools to make sure you use energy in a much more systematic manner. And it also sort of overlaps with the whole idea of a renewable energy ecosystem. So if you have residential solar, and you make sure that you're using energy properly, consuming it well enough in your homes, you could have an electric vehicle connected to the system and really have vehicle to grid swapping, whatever the case you're interested in. So overall, the home energy management sort of software or just hardware in general is going to see a lot more deployment because of COVID-19 as the world sort of moves to a higher remote commerce as well. So again, similar to the first section of the infrastructure side of things, most of the energy components outside biofuels are going to see a positive impact. And on this figure, you can see somewhat of a conclusion of how smart cities are going to behave. So you can see that the infrastructure deployment, whether it's for 5G, robotics, telemedicine, it's all going to accelerate. And you're going to see these kind of investments and for the infrastructure to move forward much faster. So with that sense, the smart city visualization or the vision of smart city remains unchanged from COVID. Similarly, in energy, what we are going to see is that more renewable energy, more residential solar is going to get deployed. And because of that, the whole transition of energy from fossil fuels to greener sources is also going to expedite. So again, the future vision of a smart city that is a lot more greener, less emissions also doesn't change. In fact, it goes further. The aspect of a smart city where things do change in a post-COVID world is going to be mobility. Shared mobility is going to suffer. Autonomous vehicles, at least in the near term, will suffer because there isn't enough opportunity to trial things, to really get the data going. Electric vehicles initially are also going to suffer purely because they're not profitable in this environment where economic activity is low. So mobility is where the smart cities vision might change slightly. And this is going to be, of course, in the next 5 years or so before things return back to normal. But with that said, we are already seeing this sort of a visualization or impact of these trends in the way we see in the public domain. So recently, the World Economic Forum did actually do a study. And what they found is that most of these cities actually are seeing a more of a transition towards bikes. So I think 3 of the 4 cities in China, for that matter, who have suffered through COVID-19, actually gave way to more deployment of bikes, more sort of activities around biking, hiking, whatever be the case. And this is something we see how smart cities are going to evolve as well. Because we have to remember the fundamental goal of a city or smart city is to help improve the quality of life for the citizens. It doesn't always have to be a digital technology that you're going to use to sort of create that. So in the case of shared mobility, if the options of having vehicles or just grab share or anything goes away, if the governments work together and push more bikes, more ride sharing for that matter here, the city will still remain smart, just that it'll slightly adopt around the mobility side of things. So we talked about sort of the three main taxonomies of a smart city. We have seen that the development of the infrastructure and energy, for that matter, is going to continue, and there's going to be some slight changes in the aspects of mobility. So of course, the question we also want to answer today is that what impact it has for the industry. So if you're on the phone, you're somebody who's actively participating in the smart city ecosystem, what kind of action items you can expect because of COVID. And I think for that, what we have done is that all the technologies we have analyzed, both on this call today and also in our own research, what we're doing is that we're bucketing them into sort of two sort of like aftermath shocks, as we call it. So depending on the technology you're looking into, COVID might create a dynamic shock as something that in the near term or midterm has a certain change or prioritization. But eventually, once the macroeconomic recovery happens, it goes back to whatever the trend or projection was supposed to be on. The second shock is the persistent shock, where something happens right now, like the way I spoke of biofuels, and that impact remains regardless of whatever recovery happens. So these are persistent shocks, and those are the more dangerous ones because that's where you really have to change the strategy around any technology. So we can use these same sort of thinking to also analyze your action items on smart cities as well. So again, coming back towards sort of the analysis we've done today. So let's talk about autonomy and electrification. What's going to happen sort of in the sides of mobility? And as I earlier mentioned that autonomy is going to get hindered in the near term, and trials are going to get halted. Development is going to be slow, and social distancing will eventually sort of have more deployment of autonomy with like driverless vehicles. But right now it's going to suffer. So if you see on the figure on the right, what autonomy is suffering is essentially a dynamic shock. Right now, it's a negative impact, but subsequently, in the longer term, 5 years down the line, it's going to be on the same trajectory that it used to be. Similarly, for electrification, it's going to be hurt in the near term, but as sort of a year or so goes back down the line, then because of regulations, because of government sort of interfering, we should see sort of the electrification market also return back to its usual projection, whatever sort of analysis has been done around them as well. And this is something we have seen in the market as well. So for example, we are seeing companies like GM. So one of the startups, they have backed Cruise, for that matter, laid off 8% of its staff who was specifically working on autonomous vehicles. So there's been an unfortunate sort of trend there. But we're also seeing companies like Amazon trying to acquire someone like Zoox, who is building a self-driving car. So there's a bit of a positive development here as well. But again, we're seeing companies like Ford postponing the development of autonomous vehicles up until 2022 as well. So it's been a mixed impact of COVID-19 on autonomy. And like we said, that in the near term, it's going to be somewhat negative, and eventually it's going to move back to how it used to be before. Now, again, talking about sort of the infrastructure technologies, which we called out to have a very positive impact. And you can see on the figure here as well, any sort of enabling technology, smart wearables, augmented reality, whatever be the case, they are going to see much of a boost right now in the near term, but even in the longer term, they're going to remain positive. So this is a persistent shock, something that stays on. So something like augmented reality, it's always been around. People have not used it that much because there's been an issue with using it, sort of making sure that things work fine. But once it starts getting used, so it's going to enable more remote guidance, more maintenance in manufacturing. Similarly, more wearables will be used for symptom identification, tracing for that matter. And this is not just for digital technologies, even for material science, things such as antimicrobials that again have been around for a while are now seeing more of a development. So this quote from the CEO of Ford sort of sums it up, that they're going to use antimicrobial coats or coatings on steering wheels, door handles, locks, anything they can find in a vehicle. So of course, antimicrobials can't really protect us from a virus, but at least it can do something against microbes. And of course, this gives an idea as what we can do in the future for the automotive industry as well. And then lastly, that's something we are seeing again happening in the industry as well. So regardless of how the economic activity is happening, regardless of how different governments have been reacting, when it comes to the tech industry, development of new products for smart cities is continuing to happen. So just recently, Samsung and Microsoft came together. They're going to build digital twins of buildings. They're going to use smart devices such as a smart TV, smartphones to really collate data and make sure you can run buildings, HVAC, whatever be the case, in a much more efficient manner. So these kind of developments are still happening, regardless of COVID, around digital technologies for smart cities. And then finally coming towards sort of the energy side of things, and as I earlier called out, we are going to see a persistent shock for biofuels, synthetic fuels. So they're going to stay on a negative trajectory, and unfortunately, this will be a decline for this industry. First, because of very cheap oil prices, and by the time that recovers, because of the competition from electric vehicles and really emerging technologies like hydrogen that can actually play along with the renewable energy ecosystem, are going to see a persistent long-term sort of impact in terms of positive sort of ability. And again, a good example of this is that many cities, regardless of how COVID is happening, are still continuing with their goals of banning diesel, gasoline, or any fossil fuels. So the UK government, who initially planned for banning diesel and gasoline by 2040, is now actually thinking of doing this by 2035 itself. So there's been no changes again in how a vision of a smart city is going to be around the use of fuels. It's still on the go, and I think that's again sort of in synergy to what we are seeing in the energy side of things as well. So with that said, here are 3 final takeaways from our side for you to just remember on smart cities. So overall, the only sort of impact in a smart cities vision is going to be on the mobility side of things. So the pace of development for electric vehicles and autonomy in general is going to drop. It's going to recover eventually, but we need at least a big amount of investments and a good regulation sort of coming through to get this industry back up again. So for cities to really ensure smart mobility, they'll have to find new investments and work with tech players to really get some regulations going through to really revive the smart mobility landscape. The smart energy ecosystem will continue to grow. It'll become more and more decentralized, and more renewable energy will be used. And we already know the energy transition has been taking place. And people like to put a number, 2050, 2060, whatever, for when most of the world will be relying on renewable energy. Whatever the number you had, you can easily bring it back a bit further. So because the transition is going to become much more quicker because of COVID. And then lastly, when it comes to sort of the deployment of the infrastructure, the digital technologies, this is where a rapid acceleration will happen. So any automation that makes sure that in factories, warehouses where you still need people to come can sort of be in isolation. You can automate things will be where we'll see lots more deployment, and of course on the healthcare side of things. So like telemedicine, digital therapeutics, all of these technologies will see a great sort of development as well. But all in all these technologies will make sure that the quality of life for people in a smart city will continue to improve, which, as I earlier mentioned, is the main goal of a smart city as well. So with that said, thank you very much for being a great audience, and I look forward to some questions now.
Right, thank you so much, Hashim, for deep insight shared in your presentation. Actually, there's a question from the audience. Maybe we'll go with that first. What is the hurdles for having a positive impact on hydrogen in the short-term context? And could hydrogen be adopted for buildings electrification soon?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So in the near term, the issue with hydrogen is that it's a very capital intensive technology. So when you speak of green hydrogen, it's still at least a decade away or 15 years away before it becomes a commercial solution. So a lot of investment has to happen, and most companies that we have spoken to or seen, they have sort of held off their investments in green hydrogen for now. And also you need to build a hydrogen infrastructure. So like a good anecdote is the gas grid we have in Singapore, for example. It may not be able to actually supply hydrogen. You might need to do some upgradation there as well. So all that work is going to get, stalled at least until COVID goes away. So that's the reason why in the short term, we don't see a positive impact. And can that actually be adopted for building electrification? I think hydrogen will act as a fuel for places where you still need fuel to have. So like I mentioned, the steel manufacturing, cement manufacturing, where you can't really use electrification, that's where hydrogen will sort of come in. So it's going to largely complement the sort of the future electrification side of things.
All right. So we have some questions in the Q&A box. So Stas is asking, would you be able to elaborate on the last methodology to estimate the impact?
Right. So I think when I get the question, you're saying to estimate the impact. So if the question is around the timeline, essentially, or maybe the methodology is how we create the sort of scoring system here, is largely based on how we do interviews with people, if that's the question there. But in terms of impact, or if you're looking at the size of the bubbles, that's really based on the investment size. So what we generally do is that what is the percentage drop in the capital or R&D funding that is going to be dropped off? That's how we look at the scale as well. Similarly, we're also looking into the timelines. So the near term is generally we're looking at 6 months to 1 year. Medium term is at least 2 to 3 years, and then longer term is the 5-year sort of timeline. So those are some of the elements that we're using. But in case I'm not getting this question right, we will be sending these slides, I presume, to everybody. So you can definitely take a deeper look at our methodology in the sort of deck as well. Let me just read through these questions. So the next one is, how do you see the evolution of policies, specifically around electricity markets, evolving to enable electrification and decentralized energy? Should we start relooking at smart policies for a smart city earlier than later, especially those that pushes the decarbonization agenda? Yes, I think that's definitely a good question because, like I earlier mentioned, at least in Lux's opinion, COVID gives a great opportunity for actually transitioning the energy system towards a more decentralized and electrified sort of system. So some countries, like I think in Europe for that matter, the new sort of budgets that have been pushed out are taking that into consideration, that they need to invest even more in the sort of smart energy ecosystem because this is a great opportunity. But in most countries, this is not being looked into. So I definitely agree with you here that now is the time to sort of really talk about this and really get the decarbonization agenda going. So yeah, definitely the policies need to be revisited if we want to sort of use this opportunity. Okay, and then the question is, can you please explain what you mean by remote commerce in renewable energy and why the impact will be slightly positive? Yes, I think what's important to call out is that all the trends may or may not directly impact a certain technology. So I think if you recall the electric vehicle section, some of the trends had no impact on the technology itself. So in the case of remote commerce, why we see renewable energy will get a bit of a push is because the consumption of energy is going to move away from centralized assets like a warehouse, office buildings, something like that, to housing, where almost every different complex or apartment might have a residential solar system or something going through. So as this move of consumption goes to a residential side, you could see more adoption of just distributed assets happening. And also when you are consuming most of the energy at home, as an end customer, you might become at least more interested in buying greener sources because that's a lot more in your sort of hand as well. Okay, I see this question as well, which is on, can you share some examples of AR industrial applications? Are there any promising applications in energy industry? Yes, I think this is definitely a question that's a bit adjacent to the topic for today, but I think what I'll say is that augmented reality right now is mostly used for training of staff is what we have seen. And in the energy industry, say in refineries or oil fields, any offshore environment where you want to train the staff before they go to a certain asset, that's where most of the AR is being used. And the new or innovative thinking that's happening here is that how do you connect a digital twin with augmented reality sort of ecosystems? So if you're creating a twin, can that same sort of 3D environment being used for an augmented reality sort of headset as well? So if you could do that, then it's like killing two birds with one stone. So that's sort of where the new sort of interest is coming through. But in the energy industry, it's still mostly around training or just making sure staff is prepared before they go offshore.
Right.
Right.
Okay, so I think we answered some of the questions in the Q&A box. I believe we should give the audience some more time to ask more questions since we have a bit more time. Maybe I will jump in and ask some questions that we have. Actually, you mentioned earlier that COVID has resulted to some of the smart city deployment project was cancelled. With the global pandemic affecting our region, in fact, increasingly. What are the challenges in smart city deployment in Southeast Asia, maybe before and after COVID? And how might we mitigate and navigate through these challenges?
Yeah. Yeah, the interesting thing we have seen is that most of the cancellations have happened because of the capital. I think that seems to be the main issue, and so this is something that should recover once governments start to reinvest. And when it comes to the perspective of smart cities in Asia, what we have seen different is that smart cities require a very strong governance or a great leadership in the government in the first place, because in smart cities, the city is the one who puts the contracts out. They're the ones who will call out to vendors and service providers to come and build something. So Singapore is a great example where the smart city concept has really been admired across the world, and it stems from a really good governance. We who clearly know how the city is going to look like. So that's something we feel has been missing in this part of the world, especially on a city level. But recently, I think we have seen, I think Kuching, for example, has launched a 5-year plan as well to build a smart city. So these ideas are coming through in Asia, but this is less of a tech problem, more of a issue of how strong the governance is in the first place. So they know how to really, get the strategy going.
Thank you so much. So actually, from your sharing, I also understand that generally smart cities project have a good runway over the long term, perhaps with the exception of mobility. However, we are seeing business struggling and mostly turn into survival mode with cost cutting and right sizing happening right now. Do you think there will be a gap in the smart cities investments and deployment? And in fact, this is also quite aligned with your response just now. Who might be leading the smart cities innovation moving forward? The public sectors, the corporates, or even startup?
Yeah, and I think what we are sort of envisioning is that the tech companies who are becoming even more profitable, who are having more cash flow because of COVID. So, like say a Microsoft or Google, any of these companies who are actually benefited from COVID, they are the ones who are building new products also around smart cities. And it won't be surprising if they are the ones who approach cities with sort of an idea that here's our new technology and we'll give you a bit of a capital to help you set this up. And in the longer run, they sort of secure these contracts with multiple cities in a particular country or anything like that. So, for example, here in Singapore, the example I mentioned of Microsoft and Samsung creating twins for smart buildings, it's being done in Singapore. Coincidentally, that's where the first deployment will happen. But before that, they actually did a pilot deployment in their own office, the Microsoft office. They created a twin of that in partnership with the Singaporean government as well. So this is like a smart city initiative that's being led by Microsoft from the outset, and they're pushing it, maybe convincing the governments that let's do this. So I think in the future it's going to be in that direction. The companies who are really benefiting from COVID will be the ones who have the money, have the tech to sort of push this through. So they're going to push it, unfortunately, as opposed to the city who should be doing it. But that's just the nature of how the world will behave post-COVID.
Okay. Before I ask my next question, I just want to remind the audience, if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand through the Zoom function or type your question in the Q&A. So maybe I'll just go with my last question. Where do you think are the opportunity for smart cities players like startup investors and so on to focus on? You mentioned several areas that some of the investors and even technology companies are working on right now because of COVID. But from a middle term, where should they pivot towards to, or even focus on their efforts and investment money?
Right. Yeah, and I think so. And the answer to that definitely lies in the sort of how we visualize a smart city, which is like basically the goal of a smart city is to enable higher quality of life for the citizens. And right now, the main element that's where the quality of life is, an issue is the healthcare side of things. So like people are most concerned about their health, or they want to just monitor, measure their performance. heart malperformance, whatever be the case. So any opportunities in telemedicine or digital therapeutics, wearables, is where I think the opportunity is going to be for a sustained period. Just because not only is it valuable for an industrial setting, but also in the consumer side of things. So I wouldn't be surprised if the sales for, like, say, Apple Watch or something have gone up in the post-COVID world, because people just want to be a lot more monitoring their, like, bodies or something like that. So yeah, I think if there's one area I would call out, I think it's definitely the healthcare, any innovation in that. That's where the the opportunity lies, at least for startups and investors moving forward.
All right. Thank you so much for the interesting insight from your presentations. I don't think that we have any more questions from the audience, so perhaps we will stop now. In fact, we are right on time at 4:30. So as we come to the end of today's sessions, let's give a round of virtual applause to you. Thank you so much for sharing your insight and your opinions on the topic of smart cities. So for the audience, at the end of this webinar, there'll be a survey for you to give feedback for us to continue to provide excellent webinars for our future sessions. So please follow us on Ecolab's LinkedIn page and join us live next week, Wednesday on 12 August at 3:30 p.m. for the next Ecolab webinar series on Korean venture capitals, space and startup ecosystem from the Korean Investor Partners Corporation. So meanwhile, stay at home, be safe and healthy. Thank you so much. Thank you, Hashif, for joining us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.